Hello everyone and Happy New Year! I hope you had a good year of 2023 in reading, and even if not, I wish you a good reading year in 2024. I find it hard to believe that I'm now making my 4th annual Best of the Year video, and yet here we are. This is always one of my videos I most enjoy making each year, with a chance to reflect on the stuff I've read throughout the year, the mood I was in at the time I was reading, and what stood out to me amid the whole selection for the year. I've again chosen the 10 books that were the most memorable or enjoyable reads for me this year, and I'm going to go through the list and say a bit about each one of them. Some of these books, although not nearly as many as I might have liked, are ones that I actually discussed in dedicated reviews on my channel this year. A few more might be ones that I'll review at some point still, while for others, unfortunately, I think I just missed the boat on them. Regardless, they're all books that I quite enjoyed and that made the 2023 reading year what it was for me. I found it pretty challenging making this list because while there were a few books that really blew me away this year, there were many books that I read and simply thoroughly enjoyed. And for those, it's hard to narrow down all the books to just a few favorites. But all in all, I read very few books this year that I actually disliked, and quite a few of the books I read didn't make this list, but I wouldn't hesitate to recommend them. One other thing I'll mention, I really enjoy reading historical nonfiction books and have mentioned a handful of them on this channel in the past. This year wasn't my most prolific history reading year, but I did read a few history books in part or in full, and was given some extra motivation from following along with the Historathon 2023 project, which I learned about from John David and which was run by a group of several dedicated history readers. I mention that here because they're doing another similar thing in 2024, and I'll post information in the description section for the video. But none of the few history books that I read this year actually made it into my top 10, so this is probably the most appropriate place to mention it. I also haven't determined a particular ranking of these books or anything like that. I'll just be presenting my top 10 with a few special notes at the end for the ones that really stood out for me. Also, while I'll be saying what I enjoyed, I won't be going into plots or content in great detail, which I reserve more for my dedicated reviews, and I also won't spoil any endings. So here we go. I read quite a few classics this year, including some contemporary classics, 20th century classics, and some older classics. Some of them were more 19th century classics, I think. So you'll certainly be seeing a handful of those in this list. Not to mention also a few classic mystery novels. In fact, a surprisingly large fraction of this year's top reads were classics in one sense or another. Not that those were all I read this year, but I guess they just have a higher probability of being ones I actually really like. But the most recent of these classics, which I enjoyed, was Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. I actually just released a separate review video of that book in which I explore some of the themes and the aspects of this short novella that stood out for me. At its essence, though, there's a lot for readers to find in this deceptively simple story about an old fisherman struggling against a fish that seems to be the biggest catch of his life. While in some sense it reads like a parable, the old man and his environment come to life much more than I initially expected, and different readers will find a whole variety of different aspects that speak to them in this novel. Not bad for my first ever Hemingway novel. Now, one mystery novel I read this year that really surprised me was Anthony Horowitz's The Twist of a Knife, which I kind of just randomly picked up from the library before heading out on a vacation. I read Horowitz's Stormbreaker series about the teen spy Alex Rider when I was a kid, which I enjoyed, although even at the time I could tell they were a little bit formulaic and maybe not totally outstandingly written, but very entertaining. But the more exposure, even brief, that you've had to Horowitz's other works like the Alex Rider series, or some of the David Suchet Hercule Poirot series that he contributed to, or his own TV series, The Midsummer Murders, or Foyle's War, he really is a prolific writer. The more you've encountered of those, the more fun it makes this book from his Hawthorne and Horowitz series. Though I didn't know it when first picking up this book, there is this central and very well executed gimmick, which is that the real-life Horowitz, with his real-life past and his real-life home in London, is a character in these books, working with the fictional detective Hawthorne to solve a series of mysteries. The book I picked up, The Twist of a Knife, happened to be the 4th one in the series, which is not really the recommended reading order, but it was totally enjoyable nevertheless. The way Horowitz weaves himself into the story and cracks jokes about all the work he's previously done is highly entertaining, particularly in this installment of the series in which most of the jokes are at his own expense, and in which some of his writing history actually gets him into a bit of trouble. I later also read the first book in the series, The Word is Murder, and while I enjoyed that one too, I didn't find it quite as strong for me as The Twist of a Knife, in which our protagonists attempt to solve a murder at the opening night of a play that Horowitz himself wrote. Whether you want to take on the entire series or not, this book is really worth a read, just because it's quite clever the way Horowitz sets it all up. And it's not a bad mystery either, although as with some of Horowitz's other inventions, I think readers will have to be incredibly observant and maybe also have a bit of luck to figure out the final solution, given all the red herrings that there are. Another contemporary popular novel that I read and enjoyed in a strange way was My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. This book told from the perspective of a depressed and also extremely self-centered 20-something millennial who decides to sleep her year away to restore herself to full health is written so well that it's compulsive reading. But some readers may be put off by the content, in particular alienated by the protagonist's callous attitude towards everyone else in her life. I found myself annoyed at times while reading, wondering what the value even was in reading from the perspective of such a character, but in the end, after reflecting on the whole experience and listening to what many others had to say about it, I finally came around. At the very least, I have to admire the author's ability in writing a story that manages to be entertaining, even while frequently discussing some of the most mundane aspects of trying to fall asleep. Actually, my experience of this book was pretty unique as well, in that I listened to it while recovering from COVID, and I actually felt like I just wanted to sleep all the time. So I could definitely relate in that way to the main character. Now bringing in another classic that you could say I was overdue for at this point, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen was a great read this year. It was my fifth of Jane Austen's 6 novels, and one that I hope to discuss more in detail here at some point. Every one of Jane Austen's novels has been a delight for me, so much that I've delayed reading this novel until now because I guess I just wanted to save a few for later, and this really was no exception. Some reviewers I watch mention that this is one of Austen's novels that grows on you more over time, and I can definitely see that, though there's still much to enjoy right from the start. The novel contains Austen's signature satirical style and deep character development that I've come to love, but it also differs from her other novels in that it feels at times quite a bit darker and more despairing than some of her more lighthearted works, despite ending, as usual, on a more upbeat note. It's definitely one I'd recommend to pretty much anyone who's up for the old-fashioned writing style and enjoys a nice, rich novel, particularly one with the witty, satirical element that just characterizes all of Austen's writing. I read quite a few Agatha Christie novels this year, most of them Hercule Poirot novels falling into her later, less famous era. I'm counting 6 novels overall, and for most of those I'm unfortunately delayed on my review videos, but that's life, and I actually do plan to review each one starting with Cat Among the Pigeons very soon. I've filmed that review already, I'm just working on editing it. Speaking of which, Cat Among the Pigeons, though unconventional in some ways for a Poirot novel, receives an honorable mention here because it was probably my favorite of these novels I read this year. In fact, the most memorable of the Christie works I read this year was in fact neither a Poirot story nor a novel. It was in fact the Miss Marple short story collection, The 13 Problems, which contained a number of short mysteries that I really enjoyed. I don't really have a lot to say about the individual mysteries here other than that they're framed within a nice device of an evening dinner party in which the guests pose different challenges to one another, and old Aunt Marple is the only one who can really offer any meaningful insight to these cases. A fun read, especially if you're interested in tackling a whole mystery one evening before bed or something like that. Another book I really enjoyed this year was Joan Didion's essay collection Slouching Towards Bethlehem, which was one of 2 books in this list that I read with Davood Gozli's reading group. I'll link his channel below, as this is the second year in a row that books he suggested have made the top 10 list, and he and the others in his group have definitely encouraged me both to continue reading deeply and also to explore some more philosophical and or literary works that I was already inclined to read, but that I may not have prioritized or made the leap to reading without that extra bit of encouragement. So thanks to Davood and others in that group. Anyway, Slouching Towards Bethlehem is an interesting one because it's a collection of maybe around 20-ish essays written during a certain time period in the late 1960s by author Joan Didion, spanning a variety of different topics, but mostly set within her native California, where I also live now. This book is divided into 3 sections, and my favorite one of those sections was the final one, called 7 Places of the Mind, in which she paints a sort of impressionistic picture of 7 different cities or locations that have been important to her, and the picture that they've formed in her own mind. The very last one, focused on New York City, stands out to a lot of readers, and for any of you New Yorkers out there, it may be worth reading just on its own if you have the chance. So now I'll also mention another one that I read with Davood's group, which was The Fall by Albert Camus. My first Camus I've read, not too long of a read, although full of reflection and food for thought, and one that I recommend for any more philosophically inclined readers out there. The entire work is the narration of a possibly former judge who approaches a stranger in a bar and takes it upon himself over a series of meetings with this other person he meets to recount his entire life, his fall from grace. Reflective readers will enjoy the challenge of determining where their views align or do not align with those of this narrator, and what to make in the end of this strange monologue. Definitely a worthwhile read, and one that many people say they receive differently when rereading at different points during their lives. In fact, I've heard it said by a few different readers that Earlier in their lives, they're more sympathetic to the arguments of this judge penitent, but then later in their lives, they're more critical of this narrator. Just an observation. Now I'll mention Americanah by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which I reviewed very recently on my channel despite reading it at the beginning of the year. Those of you who watched my review of it may be surprised to see it here, since a lot of that review turns slightly towards the ranting side of what I think went wrong, particularly in the middle of this book. Yet, all in all, this was a very memorable and well-written read, even in some of its weaker parts, and the better parts I can now confidently say formed an excellent start to my reading year. The book, for those of you who haven't watched my review of it or heard of it already, is about a Nigerian woman who moves to the US for college and reflects on how her life has changed as a result of coming here to the US, as she contemplates returning to Nigeria. That description sounds rather dull though, but in reality the book is a rich story of the many relationships, big and small, formed by our narrator Ifemelu during her teens and 20s, and the narrative style was enjoyable for me in a way unlike many other novels I've read. So we're down to 2 remaining books, and although I've not been ranking these books in any particular order, I can at least say that of these final 2 books in the list, they were my favorites of the year. One of those, also read towards the beginning of the year, was God, Human, Animal, Machine by Megan O'Giblin, a memoir/philosophical reflection on the intersection of God, humans, animals, and machines that feels particularly relevant in the modern age. This book isn't super long, but it's dense in its content, pulling together ideas from a wide range of philosophers, authors, and thinkers, past and present, including the author herself, who turns this book into a sort of personal reflection on our search for meaning and the answers to questions of where we fit in within the cosmic picture. Some people will love it, and others may just not be that interested, but you'll already know from this description if it's something worth looking into further. And if you still can't make up your mind, well, watch my separate review on it. My favorite book of the year, though, was one of the very first books I read this year, and one that unfortunately managed to slip by without me ever reviewing it here. It's a book that came out a few years ago and has been on my radar for a while, but I just hadn't gotten around to reading it until my sister-in-law once again brought it to the top of my mind, saying she really enjoyed it. This top read of the year was comedian Trevor Noah's Born a Crime, his reflections on life growing up in South Africa as a mixed-race child towards the end of apartheid. In this memoir, he successfully mixes together humorous anecdotes with more serious reflections in a way that is always entertaining and educational. And though he certainly has his opinions, as we all do, it's not a book that ever came across as preachy to me. He, for the most part, just tells his stories and lets you put together the pieces for yourself. Part of this, I think, is because although you might expect differently if you've just seen snippets of Trevor Noah from his time on The Daily Show, he's always come across to me as someone deeply thoughtful, able to relate to many different points of view and draw connections between experiences. And here he showcases a wide collection of experiences that he amassed during his time growing up in South Africa, experiences that will be new and fresh for most readers, including myself. In fact, one thing I really took away from this book is that his experience growing up as a mixed-race child, specifically in South Africa, in which there were very few other kids like him in that regard, forced him to learn to blend in with many different groups of people who normally remain separate and have different ideas. He calls it being a chameleon. All in all, a highly recommended book that is both accessible and really powerful. So that's 2023. Thanks for joining me on this review of the year, and I hope that you and I will be back here again in a year from now, exploring an equally excellent list of books from the year ahead. And let us all know here if there are any books you really enjoyed this year. Although I don't mention them too often, I really do appreciate the recommendations that some of you have given in the comments for other videos. And at some point, I'll probably actually do a video on one of them. But aside from that, happy 2024 and happy reading.